On July 10th, the 47th President of the United States sent Canada a letter that sounded less like diplomacy and more like a schoolyard message: 35% tariff, effective August 1st. No detailed explanation, no formal hearings, not even an economic justification, just Trump's signature and an unspoken message. This is personal. A few days earlier, Japan got a similar note. The message was loud and clear. America's trade decisions are no longer about data. They're about emotions, and the current occupant of the White House is treating longtime allies the way he treats old business partners, pressuring them for one more deal. Canada didn't complain. Instead, they repositioned. They quietly started building new trade pathways, leaned more toward Asia, and prepared for the next unpredictable move from Washington. Because this wasn't negotiation, it was improvisation. And when a global superpower starts improvising with its friends, those friends start rehearsing life without it. The letter to Canada wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a wider pattern. By mid-July, more than 20 countries had received similar letters. Each one came with urgency, emotion, and a direct line from the Oval Office, not the State Department. The handwriting was clear. The subtext was even clearer: comply or pay. Trump invoked Section 232, wrapping these moves in the language of national security, but the targets weren't enemy nations. They were allies: Canada, Japan, Germany, even Brazil, which faced a 50% tariff, not because of trade issues, but because of how they treated their former president. This wasn't normal policy. It was foreign relations turned personal. A new phrase started to spread: Liberation Day tariffs. The idea? Sovereign nations were told, renegotiate, or face economic fire. The deadlines were impossibly short. The conditions were vague. The consequences were blunt. In this new version of emotional trade, global trust becomes the first casualty. Allies no longer analyze signals, they analyze tone. And right now, the tone coming from Washington feels less like strategy and more like a warning shot. Canada didn't shout back. It leveled up. While the White House issued bold threats with tight deadlines, Ottawa chose a different strategy: silence, not passivity, but calculation. Behind the scenes, Canadian negotiators quietly met with U.S. officials, giving the appearance of cooperation. But beneath the surface, realignment was happening. Canada deepened its relationship with ASEAN, pushing for trade routes that completely bypass Washington. In a rare but symbolic step, Canada and Japan signed a bilateral intelligence sharing agreement, the first ever between the two nations. Back home, the Trudeau-Carney administration fast-tracked plans to export liquefied natural gas and critical minerals, like nickel, lithium, and cobalt, directly to Asia and Europe, cutting out the American middleman. Japan also felt the impact, but unlike Canada, Tokyo spoke up. Japan's trade minister called the tariffs economic coercion, accusing the U.S. of abusing national security exceptions. Yet Japan didn't walk away from negotiations. Instead, they built a new table. Japan reopened trade talks with the European Union, revived infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia, and made it clear they're working to reduce their reliance on the U.S. market. Neither Canada nor Japan chose confrontation. They chose adaptation. Together, they're quietly crafting a new trade network, one focused on diversification, resilience, and a shared skepticism of Washington's unpredictability. These moves aren't grabbing headlines in the U.S., but they're echoing in boardrooms and currency markets around the world. For the United States, the cost isn't just lost trade opportunities, it's something bigger. It's trust. And it's in supply chains quietly rerouting across oceans. Today, America's allies are learning a difficult but necessary lesson. They can no longer assume that the United States will lead global trade with the same consistency it once did. The world is shifting, and so are long-standing trade patterns. Look at what's happening right now. Liquefied natural gas tankers, once destined for ports along the U.S. Gulf Coast, are increasingly redirecting toward the Pacific. Japanese automakers, companies that for decades relied on New York's financial system, are now moving their financing operations to Frankfurt. These may seem like isolated changes, but they are signs of a deeper shift. For Washington, this could become a painful realization. Tariffs might help win isolated trade battles, but they could end up losing alliances in the long run. The world isn't retaliating with loud protests or threats. Instead, it's quietly reorganizing the global trade structure, a move that could end up leaving the U.S. on the sidelines. And for America's 47th president, this might be one of the toughest lessons to learn. Sometimes, silence is more powerful than protest. and detachment can hurt more than open defiance. As Canada and Japan reposition themselves globally, they are doing more than simply reacting to U.S. trade policies. They are laying the foundation for a new economic era. By July 2025, this shift is no longer speculative. It's reality. Both Canada and Japan have moved from defensive, reactionary trade strategies to proactive global designs. Canada is pushing forward with rapid LNG exports, signing contracts to send gas to Asia and Europe. These deals are carefully structured to avoid U.S. regulatory bottlenecks, cutting out layers of American oversight that once slowed international energy trade. But Canada isn't stopping at natural gas. Ottawa is also accelerating the export of critical minerals like nickel, cobalt, and lithium, materials that are indispensable to electric vehicles and modern tech industries. These resources form the backbone of tomorrow's supply chains, and Canada is positioning itself as a central supplier, leaving the U.S. exposed to new vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, Japan is taking a similar path, but with its own strategy. Tokyo is rapidly signing free trade agreements across Southeast Asia, strengthening partnerships with countries in the ASEAN bloc. At the same time, Japan is expanding digital trade and data-sharing deals, building resilient supply chains that don't rely on U.S. approval or infrastructure. This is a conscious shift, one that reorients trade flows away from Washington's influence. This isn't about retaliation. It's about redesigning the global economic map. According to Bloomberg, Canada's LNG exports to Asia are on track to increase by 30% by 2026, while Japan's free trade agreements with ASEAN economies are expected to boost trade volume by 25% by the end of 2025. These changes are already reducing America's share in some of the world's most critical trade corridors. The financial impact is not small. Analysts estimate that these moves could shave $12 billion a year off U.S. export revenues, especially in sectors like energy and critical minerals. That's roughly equivalent to a 0.2% reduction in America's GDP growth. But the consequences go beyond numbers on a spreadsheet. This shift is going to be felt in everyday life. Energy prices in the U.S. could rise as domestic gas plants lose access to export markets and face shrinking demand. Tech companies may find themselves paying more for essential battery materials, driving up costs for electric vehicles, smartphones, and other consumer electronics. Midwestern farmers who planted soybeans expecting stable U.S. export routes are suddenly facing unexpected competition from Canadian exports, priced specifically for Asian buyers. On the logistics side, Gulf Coast ports are already seeing their shipping traffic redirected to Vancouver, signaling that America's once secure logistical advantage is eroding. For regular consumers, this shift is not some distant issue in global politics. It means higher costs at the gas pump, at grocery stores, and in technology purchases. For American workers, it could translate into job losses in industries that were once supported by U.S.-Canada trade links, industries that may not be easily rebuilt once the supply chains are gone. And for policymakers, this is more than a trade issue. It's a strategic warning. Tariffs might shield certain industries temporarily, but when two of America's top 5 trade partners choose to rebuild global supply networks without the U.S., who actually benefits in the long run? This is not business as usual. Canada and Japan aren't just adapting, they are building a new global order, crafting supply chains and trade policies that prioritize resilience, diversity, and independence from American control. This is the new normal, and the rest of the world is already moving forward. The world is shifting toward a new kind of trade system, a multipolar and flexible global economy where no single nation has the power to dictate terms. Countries are waking up to the dangers of overdependence. They are building trade networks designed to protect themselves from the unpredictable decisions of any one government. Today, every time Japan or Canada signs a fresh trade deal, the White House doesn't just see lost business. It feels its grip on global influence slipping away. Washington understands that as these new trade corridors form, America's role as the central hub of global commerce is slowly fading. With these tectonic shifts in mind, the United States government pivoted its attention to Brazil, one of the biggest emerging players in the global market. In early July, the 47th President of the United States made a move that, honestly, stunned both political analysts and economists alike. He announced a sweeping 50% tariff on Brazilian exports, covering key products like beef, coffee, and copper. The policy was set to take effect on August 1st, but here's what made the announcement even more controversial. The The tariffs weren't imposed because of trade imbalances or unfair economic practices. Instead, the justification was political. The U.S. president declared the tariffs in response to the ongoing legal troubles of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, calling him a victim of political persecution and a witch hunt. To escalate matters further, the administration also triggered a Section 301 investigation into Brazil's digital trade sector, a move that sent a loud message. This wasn't about economics anymore. It was about using trade as a tool of punishment, forcing other countries to align with U.S. political preferences or, well, face consequences. The reaction in Brasilia was immediate and intense. President Lula and Vice President Alckmin convened emergency meetings, bringing together top officials to craft a plan of action. They quickly formed a special task force, tasked with protecting Brazilian industries that were about to be hit hard by the new tariffs. In record time, Brazil passed a new reciprocity law, signaling to Washington that it would not back down. The law authorized economic and legal countermeasures, preparing Brazil to retaliate in kind. Meanwhile, Brazil's beef exporters found themselves in chaos. The United States is heavily dependent on Brazilian beef, especially for the fast food industry. Brazilian beef supplies the backbone of U.S. hamburger production. Suddenly, supply chains were thrown into turmoil. Exporters scrambled to reroute shipments, while American meat suppliers warned of looming shortages that would drive U.S. beef prices higher, directly impacting consumers. And it wasn't just beef. The coffee trade was also thrown into a panic. Traders rushed to get their shipments into the U.S. before the new tariffs kicked in, fearing a sharp spike in coffee prices for American households. Breakfast tables across the United States are now likely to feel the pinch. Back in Brazil, the financial markets wobbled. The real fell by over 2%, showing immediate market anxiety. But despite the initial shock, financial experts noted something important. Brazil is not as reliant on U.S. trade as it used to be. Only about 12% of Brazilian exports go to the United States. More importantly, Brazil has been building stronger trade ties with China and the BRICS alliance. This gives Brasilia room to maneuver, reducing its vulnerability to U.S. pressure. Still, the economic impacts are real and widespread. In the United States, buyers of Brazilian goods are now facing higher costs. It's not just Wall Street that's affected. It's ordinary American families at the grocery store and businesses that rely on imports. From beef and burgers to coffee and copper, prices are likely to climb. What's unfolding here is bigger than a trade dispute. It's the weaponization of commerce for political objectives. When the Oval Office decides to impose tariffs because of another country's legal proceedings, it shakes the very foundation of international trade rules. And when nations like Brazil fight back with retaliation, the global market turns into a chessboard of tit-for-tat moves. Each step leads to supply chain disruptions, unpredictable price swings, and the risk of a global economic backlash. The world is no longer just watching these trade wars from the sidelines. It's bracing for the fallout. As Brazil holds its ground, the United States may soon be forced to learn a difficult lesson. Trade is not a pawn in political theater. When leaders treat it that way, everyone, at home and abroad, pays the price. It's the invisible glue that holds nations, economies, and global systems together. But once that trust starts to crack, repairing it is never easy. Sometimes it's nearly impossible. Right now, that crack is widening and fast. Behind closed doors, the game of global trade has intensified. The Trump administration isn't just talking tough, it's setting hard deadlines. According to the latest White House statement, Canada must finalize a trade deal by July 21st. The European Union faces a similar ultimatum, with a July 31st deadline looming just before the G20 summit. But here's the catch. The G20 isn't really about crafting lasting policies anymore. Not this year. It's become more about photo ops, handshakes, and dramatic headlines than real economic solutions. For President Trump, the strategy is clear. Force a fast victory and present it as a bold leadership moment in front of voters and cameras. The goal isn't about fixing trade. It's about looking strong before the media spotlight turns on at the summit. But Canada isn't playing the same game. Instead of firing back publicly, Mark Carney, one of Canada's most strategic economic minds, has chosen a more subtle approach. There are no press conferences, no media stunts, no grandstanding. Instead, Carney is working quietly but effectively behind the scenes, sending a clear message to Washington. Canada remains a strategic partner in managing the global competition with China. We are not America's enemy, but we won't be bullied either. By keeping the conversation private and controlled, Canada is setting its own tempo. They're forcing the White House into a waiting game, knowing that Trump's tendency for impatience could cause him to backtrack on his own deadlines. In this high-stakes standoff, Canada is betting that holding firm will break the ultimatum, not their resolve. But while political leaders negotiate, ordinary people are already feeling the consequences. A recent report from the Institute for Supply Management shows that U.S. inflation reached 2.7% in June. Why? Because tariffs have made production more expensive. The cost of raw materials is rising, and so are the prices of everyday goods. Big retailers like Walmart and Shein aren't sounding alarms, but they are quietly adjusting their prices. Families are noticing their weekly bills getting higher, not because they're buying more, but because they're paying more for the same things. Even vacation plans are shrinking. According to travel surveys, American households are now planning to spend 25% less on summer trips. That's not just about saving money. It's about financial uncertainty creeping into daily life. On the business side, things aren't much better. A recent KPMG survey found that 60% of U.S. companies have seen their profit margins shrink because of these new tariffs. Even worse, a quarter of them are reporting double-digit losses in their margins, a blow that many small and medium-sized businesses simply can't afford to take. The farming sector is also caught in the crossfire. Farmers in North Dakota and Iowa, once seen as reliable food suppliers to the world, are now facing canceled contracts and supply chain disruptions. That's because countries like Canada and Japan are finding new partners, rerouting trade away from the U.S. and the Midwest auto parts industry, which is already under enormous pressure from 25% tariffs and soaring steel prices, now faces another challenge: uncertainty. If no agreement is reached by the July deadlines, this critical sector could face further shocks, with job losses on the table. The bigger risk? If Trump lets this pressure cooker boil over, the average American won't just see higher grocery bills. Companies could start freezing hiring, cutting back on investments, or even laying off workers because of the unpredictability surrounding trade policy. Inflation could climb even higher. The Federal Reserve, instead of lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy, might hesitate, afraid of pouring fuel on the inflation fire. So yes, the White House might get its headline victory, a snapshot of strength to broadcast during the G20 summit. But at what cost? While America plays to the cameras, Canada and Japan are quietly reshaping global economics. They're not doing it with flashy speeches or political theater. They're doing it with careful diplomacy, slowly shifting the global trade balance away from U.S. control. And back home, that spotlight reveals more than just political strategy. It exposes the growing cracks in the economy. For everyday Americans, these so-called negotiations are starting to look like lost jobs, higher bills, and a shrinking sense of financial security. As the 47th president prepares for applause at the G20 summit, the rest of the world is already moving on. Countries are no longer waiting for the U.S. to make the first move. They're building new systems, drafting new rules, and creating partnerships that don't revolve around Washington's approval. In the end, this isn't just about tariffs. It's not just about timelines. It's about a White House willing to gamble global trust for short-term political gains. And the question that remains is this: when the dust finally settles, will America still be seen as a trusted partner, or just another player in a game it no longer controls?